Blood of the Archon. Chapter 2. The Voyage. Percival was scared. He's big enough to admit that. At 25 years of age, he had seldom left the confines of the palace grounds, let alone travel all the way across the Bayort Strait to Athel. He had only been to Athel once before as a young child, and now here he was, on the way to that place once more. Within the hold of the ship, he was surrounded by other nobles and their processions. He had been more conservative with his entourage. He couldn't afford not to be. Just 2 trusted guards whom he'd known nearly his whole life, and whom he knew would defend him to his last breath. Andrea Poole was only a few years older than him, and he had his suspicions that she might fancy him just a bit. He did not return her affections, but found it charming nonetheless. The second guard was a man named Sir Janus Eyre. He was getting up there in age, but was still fit as he had been in his 20s, or so he said. Before joining the Drake's court, Janus had been a member of the Dragon Guard, a group of men and women dedicated to protecting Nymor from threats both magical and mundane. He had practically raised Percy, being far more of a father to him than the king. Janus had taught the young prince how to fight, despite his mother's protest that he should focus on statecraft and leave the warfare to his younger brothers. As the eldest prince, Percy had dozens of tutors to teach him how to be a good ruler. But Janus taught him how to be a good person, and for that he was eternally grateful. At this moment, however, his trusted guard and friend didn't look as distinguished as he usually did. Janus leaned against the side of the hull, clenching his fists and closing his eyes as if he was trying very hard to concentrate on something. "Looking a little green around the gills there, old man," Andrea laughed, patting the older man heartily on the back. "Poole, I swear to the gods," Janus grunted through clenched teeth. "If you don't shut your fat gob, I'll wring your skinny neck right here." That shut the poor girl up, and now she was looking nearly as pale as the man who seemed quite close to losing his lunch. Percy sighed, looking up at the man from his place on the floor where he'd situated himself. "Janus, if you're not feeling well, I'm sure we can find a healer to—" "It will pass, your highness." Janus waved his hand dismissively. "You needn't worry yourself with an old man's woes." "Nonsense. I need you in fighting form if you're to protect me. Who knows what kind of beasts or brigands that could ambush us on the way to the temple?" Smiling playfully, Percy uncrossed his legs and lifted himself up from the ground in one fluid motion. "Thank you, your highness, truly." Janus forced a smile, cringing slightly from the effort. "Andrea, stay here and make sure no one tries to snoop through my things. Some of my mother's imported quills are in there, and you know how cross father would be if I lost them." She nodded, standing to attention perhaps a bit too enthusiastically, as she whacked her head on the low ceiling of the ship's hold as she did so. As Percy wandered around the ship, he didn't recognize anyone there. That wasn't a surprise, of course. When the royalty of Eastwell or Velhaven held galas, no one ever thought to invite the royalty of Edelheim. He half expected that most of them wouldn't be able to point to it on a map, if they knew it existed at all. He couldn't help but notice the way many of them were dressed. They were all draped in silks and drenched in jewels, as if asking to be robbed. But perhaps with the company of nearly a dozen guards and 24 servants, they'd be safer than most. Percy didn't think he'd be able to find a sorcerer on board, but perhaps there might be an herbalist. Surely one of the visiting dignitaries from all over the Free Isles had brought someone with medicinal knowledge. Percy dreaded the thought of returning to Janus and Andrea empty-handed, so he pressed on. By the time he reached the room housing one of the 3 ruling families of Eastwell, he was getting quite tired of getting no answers, which was perhaps why he was a bit impatient with them. "My friend is ill. Are any of you healers?" The Suncrests looked up at him, clearly annoyed that he had interrupted their apparently very important conversation. They were a small family, unlike most royals in the Free Isles, and much tighter-knit than most as well. All of them had distinctive dark skin and pale eyes, a striking appearance that set them apart from the common folk of Eastwell, most of whom were as pale as Fjell's winter storms. "And you are?" A man with a strong chin and a weak nose glared at him. "I'm in a bit of a hurry. Now, are any of you herbalists, alchemists?" Percy tapped his foot impatiently, scanning the group for any recognition. "I am." A small woman nestled in the back of the group spoke up. She was dressed in a long dark cloak that covered her entire form, and her long black hair was tied in a braid behind her head, although a few strands hung loose. "Tessia? No." An older woman, presumably Tessia's mother or governess, grabbed her arm roughly, trying to stop her from standing up. Tessia's pale green eyes softened, and she kissed the woman on the forehead. "Don't worry, Mom. I'll be careful." Reluctantly, the woman released her arm from her grasp. Tessia turned to Percy. "Now, can you show me your friend?" When the two returned to Janus and Andrea, the old man was looking much worse for wear. He was sitting on the ground now, his head propped up on a board, and Andrea was frantically patting his sweat-soaked forehead with a piece of cloth. Percy gasped, rushing to his side. Andrea, what happened? Is he all right? I don't know, sir. I was watching your things like you asked, and he just collapsed. Oh, my. The color drained from the healer's face, and her eyes went wide. Well, don't just stand there. Help him, Percy ordered roughly, although the fear in his voice did lessen the authority he intended to project. Still, Tessia nodded and got on her knees next to the man. I'm going to need you to stand back. She closed her eyes, moving her hands to hover over the man's quivering form. What are you doing? Where are your herbs? Your potions? Percy looked frantically between her and Janice. I don't need them. Now don't make me tell you again. There was the authority Percy was looking for. He nodded, took a few steps back, and motioned for Andrea to do the same. Tessia closed her eyes, beckoning the strength she needed. Her hands surged with energy and then gradually began to glow with divine light. The light pulsed slightly, but didn't increase beyond the intensity of a candle's flame, so nobody else in the hold noticed the display of sorcery. Beads of sweat rolled down Swessia's face and onto Janice's chest, but soon his breathing evened out, and the shaking that racked his body ceased. A small smile graced Tessia's lips before she collapsed, falling into something soft and warm, Percy's arms, as it turned out, but she didn't know that. Tessia woke in her quarters on the ship, surrounded by familiar faces looking down at her with concern. As soon as the haze in her vision cleared, she felt a familiar sensation of an open-palmed hand on her cheek. That was incredibly foolish, young lady, Senior Magus Agatha scolded her. Do you even know anything about that man? His family works in dark magic, child. Should not have helped him. Her memory was hazy for a moment while she tried to remember what she'd been doing. Then it returned to her. That man, I need to tell him something. She tried to sit up, but was pushed back onto the bed by strong yet bony fingers. Not on my watch, young lady. You need to rest. She sighed, brushing hair away from Tessia's brow. You know you can't be doing magic like that, especially not so soon after your awakening. The Archon College and your parents sent me to watch over you, and I won't have you overexerting yourself with reckless magic. But, Master, Tessia protested, no buts. You will stay in that bed until we reach Aethel, or I will tie you to it. Tessia wanted to fight her, but she knew that she would lose, so she resigned herself to her comfortable prison. Surely she'd see the man again after they docked, and then she could share her suspicions. The thing that ailed his friend was no ordinary seasickness. If her suspicions were correct, it was no sickness at all. There was something arcane about it. He had been poisoned. As it turned out, Tessia did not run into Percy again once they docked. Janice was still feeling slightly under the weather by that point, so the group decided it would be wise for them to rent a few horses to take them up the long road to the small mountain village of Sanctuary. There, at the end of the road, hidden deep within the heart of the Bulwark Mountains, was the Temple of Last Rest. According to legend, it had been built by the first followers of the Covenant of Light in the middle of the Black Age and was the nameless prophet's final resting place. The nameless prophet was a slave in the Empire of Wyveria, who went against her master's dragon worship to preach a marriage between the two most prevalent deities, Tyr and Estrella. Tyr, also called the Old Man of the Forest and the Blind Hunter, was worshipped by the ancient orcs of Orcanum, some of the clans of Dejar, and the lowlander tribes of Aethel. Estrella, also called the Wayfinder and the Star Child, was worshipped by the northern tribes of Fiel, the southern people of Valmera, and the mountain tribes of Aethel. It was the nameless prophet who formed the Covenant of Light and brought the disparate human and orcs groups together, eventually toppling the Empire of Wyveria. It was under her blessing that the temple was built. Over the intervening centuries leading up to the Sun Age, the location of the temple was lost, until it was rediscovered 10 years prior by a caravan of Valmeran merchants who'd been stranded in the mountains. The temple was a massive complex, befitting the final resting place of the Covenant's prophet. As they made their way towards the massive doors, Percy couldn't help but marvel at all the diversity. There were dwarves and elves from all over the continent, and even a few hired orc mercenaries. He'd never seen so many non-humans in his entire life. His palace had a few elven servants, but here there were real-life fair folk, elves who still followed the old ways of nature's spirits and ancestor worship. And in the past, he'd only ever seen dwarves from afar when merchant caravans would stop on Edelheim on their way from Velhaven to Windhollow in the north. As for orcs, he'd only heard of disparate groups traveling through Aethel, but never seen one in person. They were massive people, most of them at least 7 feet tall. The color of their skin ranged from pale olive green to deep viridian, and most of them were adorned with intricate tattoos, the likes of which he'd only ever seen in illustrations. Orcs followed a strict philosophy of order and self-control, as was evident from their uniform posture. They were some of the best fighters in Nymar for a reason, and were highly valued by mercenary companies when they left their homeland of Orcanum. Percy doubted there had been such a diverse congregation of people such as this for the entirety of the Sun Age. As Percy and his companions stood before the wooden doors of the temple, they felt welcoming and warm, and a sense of security fell over him.